Jane only opened the cedar trunk to find her mother's traditional wedding beads. That was all. But when the heavy wooden lid pushed back, she didn't find coral or gold. She found a stack of pristine land deeds and her late father's missing corporate seal. And the terrifying part wasn't that the deeds were hidden in her fiancé's house. It was the signature transferring her family's entire multi-million-dollar estate. It wasn't signed by her late father. It was signed by Daniel, the man waiting for her at the altar downstairs. And it was dated 2 years before they even met. If you've ever looked at your savior and realized they were actually the one who set the fire, stay with me. Hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because the betrayal happening at this wedding will leave you speechless. And the bride's revenge is absolute perfection. 2 hours earlier, the massive compound was vibrating with the sound of talking drums and celebration. It was the day of Jane and Daniel's traditional wedding. Outside, hundreds of guests, high-ranking chiefs, and local media were seated under massive silk tents. Jane sat in the master suite upstairs, looking in the mirror. She was 28, dressed in magnificent, heavily embroidered silk, but her eyes held a quiet sadness. 3 years ago, she had been the sole heir to one of the wealthiest logistics empires in the region. But her father had died suddenly, and within months, his entire company collapsed. The lawyers told Jane her father had secretly accrued massive debts. The banks seized the family estate, the warehouses, and the generational land. Jane was left with nothing. Then came Daniel. Daniel was a charming, wealthy foreign investor who seemed to drop out of the sky when Jane was at her lowest. He paid off her remaining personal debts. He gave her a job. He showered her with love and told her he would protect her forever. To Jane, Daniel wasn't just a fiancé. He was her absolute savior. Downstairs, the ceremony was reaching its peak. It was time for Jane to perform the traditional wine-carrying ritual, to take a cup of palm wine, search through the massive crowd, and offer it to her husband, officially sealing the union in front of the elders. But Jane was missing one thing: her late mother's coral waist beads. Daniel had told her he brought the last of her family's storage boxes to his house and put them in the spare room. Jane walked down the hall, found the old cedar trunk, and broke the rusted padlock to open it. That is when she found the deeds. Jane stood in the quiet room, her hands shaking as she read the documents. These were the original titles to her family's massive coastal properties. The exact lands the banks claimed had been seized and sold off to anonymous buyers. She looked at the transfer signatures. The anonymous buyer was a shell company owned entirely by Daniel, and the date of the transfer was 2 full years before her father passed away. 2 years before Daniel ever, coincidentally, walked into her life. The puzzle pieces snapped together with terrifying clarity. Daniel didn't save her from ruin. He orchestrated it. He had worked with corrupt lawyers to forge her father's signature, bankrupt the company, and steal the empire for pennies. But there was one final document at the bottom of the trunk. It was a local legal statute. It stated that because the coastal lands were ancestral, the final, irrevocable transfer of ownership could only be authorized if the buyer was legally married to the direct bloodline heir. Daniel wasn't marrying her out of love. He was marrying her to secure the final legal loophole for the billion-dollar land he stole from her father. Jane didn't break down. The tears she had cried for 3 years over her family's ruin completely evaporated. The humility of the grateful rescued bride vanished. She picked up the stack of deeds, the corporate seal, and the legal statute. She tucked them neatly into the folds of her extravagant wedding wrapper. Then she picked up the ceremonial cup of wine. While she walked down the grand staircase and out into the blazing sun, the crowd erupted in cheers as the bride appeared. The talking drums grew louder. The cameras flashed. At the center of the royal pavilion sat Daniel, dressed in majestic native attire, smiling the confident, arrogant smile of a man who was minutes away from stealing a kingdom. Jane danced gracefully through the crowd, holding the cup of wine. The tradition dictated she must kneel before her chosen husband and offer him the drink. Daniel stood up, his hands outstretched, waiting for his final victory. Jane reached the center of the pavilion. She stopped right in front of Daniel. The drums faded into a respectful silence. She looked him in the eyes. His smile faltered, just for a second, when he saw the absolute 0-degree coldness in her stare. Jane didn't kneel. She didn't hand him the wine. Instead, she turned her body away from him. She walked directly to the high table where the paramount ruler, the state governor, and the chief judge of the district were seated as guests of honor. Jane placed the ceremonial cup of wine down on their table. Then, she reached into the folds of her dress and pulled out the stack of pristine deeds and her father's corporate seal. She slammed them down on the table, right next to the wine. "Elders," Jane's voice rang out through the microphone clipped to her dress, echoing across the silent compound. "I was told to bring this wine to the man who loves me, but I cannot offer wine to a thief." A collective gasp ripped through the crowd of hundreds. Daniel's face turned the color of ash. He lunged forward. "Jane, what are you doing?" "She's overwhelmed. She's not well." "I have never been better," Jane snapped, her voice like thunder. She pointed to the documents on the table. 3 years ago, my father's empire was supposedly seized by anonymous creditors. The man standing behind me claimed he rescued me from poverty. But the documents on this table prove that Daniel is the anonymous creditor. He forged my father's signature to steal our ancestral lands. The chief judge put on his glasses and picked up the first document. "And the only reason he funded this lavish wedding today," Jane continued, turning to face Daniel and the flashing cameras of the press, "is because ancestral law requires my bloodline to legitimize his stolen titles. He didn't come to marry a wife. He came to buy a signature." Daniel signaled frantically to his security guards. But the governor raised a hand. Dozens of state police officers immediately stepped in front of the royal pavilion, blocking Daniel's men. "The forgery is dated 2 years before we met," Jane said, looking Daniel dead in the eyes. "You thought because I was grieving, I was blind. You thought because I was a woman, I was weak. You built a cage of money and expected me to sing in it." The chief judge looked up from the documents, his face hardened with fury. He handed the papers directly to the commissioner of police standing beside him. Daniel's wealth and charm could buy a lot of things, but it could not buy his way out of hard documentary evidence of massive corporate fraud, delivered directly into the hands of the state's highest legal authorities, on live television. The wedding ended not with a celebration, but with handcuffs, and Daniel was escorted out of his own compound by state police, his majestic wedding attire dragging in the dust. Because the fraud was exposed before the marriage could be legally sealed, the ancestral loophole slammed shut. The state nullified the forged deeds and returned the entire estate, the logistics empire, and the coastal lands back to the sole surviving heir, Jane. She walked out of that compound not as a grateful rescued bride, but as the wealthiest woman in the region, having taken back exactly what was hers. Every person watching this needs to understand a vital lesson about human greed. A thief who tries to steal a crown will eventually be crushed by its weight. Manipulators always assume that kindness equals stupidity. They assume that if you are quiet, you are easily conquered. They never realize that the quietest people are the ones who pay the most attention. Jane didn't win by fighting Daniel in private. She won by letting him build the biggest, brightest stage possible, and then pulling the curtain down on him in front of the whole world. If this story made you smile, hit that subscribe button, drop a comment, and tell me what you would have done if you found those papers on your wedding day.